Hello and welcome to SimCast, the higher education simulation podcast. My name's Lawrence Hill and I'm the chair of the simulation group in the School of Health Sciences at UEA Norwich.
Hello everyone, my name is Tony Jeremy and I'm the academic lead for simulation-based education at UEA Norwich.
And today we are joined by the magnificent Dr. Rosie Doy. Say hello, Rosie.
Hello, Rosie.
Hi, Rosie.
I didn't recognise who Dr. Doy was.
Great to have you on the podcast.
Amazing to have you.
Disclaimer, Rosie, we know Rosie. Rosie's been around for as long as I can remember at UEA.
Yeah.
And we were saying earlier that, Lawrence, you owe your...
Yeah, I owe my career at UEA
career
to Dr. Rosie Doy, who actually was part of the team that recruited me to the UEA a little over 10 years ago now. And actually, those that don't know Rosie, and I imagine most people globally will know who Dr. Rosie Doy actually is, but in all seriousness, Rosie, particularly in the East region of the United Kingdom, has had a hand in the education of, I think thousands is probably underestimating it. It's probably tens of thousands of healthcare professionals that Dr. Doy has had a hand in educating.
Yeah.
And in this episode today, we're going to be talking about a small part of Rosie's contribution to the wider healthcare education landscape, and that is your EdD thesis, isn't it, Rosie?
That's right. Thank you for the ego stroke.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. So in this episode, we're going to be dipping into Rosie's doctoral thesis, which explored complex decision-making in paramedics and how simulation-based education can contribute to navigating complexity and uncertainty.
If you enjoyed the episode, please give us a like. Equally so, if you didn't enjoy the episode, give us a dislike, but let us know in the comments why, because we're always keen to improve. To keep up to date with all things sim, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to check that notification bell. And SimCast is also available on all popular streaming platforms. So, Rosie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, you've obviously put your blood, sweat and tears into your EdD. But if you had to sum it up in an elevator pitch, how would you do it?
I think it's about trying to better prepare learners and come to that educators, whether they're in the clinical setting or in an educational formal setting, to deal with the fact that real life is unpredictable, it is messy, and you can't pick out a formula and apply it to everybody.
Okay. And I think it's just worth us taking a moment to embrace the real life messiness, because we've actually recorded this podcast once before, haven't we? We've just spent 45 minutes chatting about things, only to realise that we hadn't pressed record on the audio. So
So we're going to spend some time in this episode talking about disorientation and how the learning experience is tricky.
So if we're a little bit kind of all over the place in this episode, that's probably why.
But it's part of the messy reality, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's kind of what your doctoral thesis, it's in the title, in fact, of your doctoral thesis, of messiness and complexity, a case study exploring student paramedics' voyages into navigating uncertainty. So can I just ask the question, why did you want to explore this as a topic?
In order to do that, I'll just step back a little bit and say about how I came to this and a little bit about my career, because as it was a qualitative study, I needed to be really aware about how I might be shaping the agenda and how to take steps around that. And I started many moons ago as a general nurse, now called adult nursing, and frequently felt utterly unable to help people who had emotional and psychological needs, not just physical needs, who needed tablets dished out or pressure area care every 4 hours or whatever. So I then went to mental health nursing, and even though it was in the days when things were really quite institutionalised, I realised it was helping piece the jigsaw of people together a bit more. And then I went into clinical practice where I could bring psychological and physical healthcare together. And that was kind of the card-carrying agenda I've had as an educationalist, not just with paramedics, but trying to make sure that people who are learning to be a healthcare or care professional understand that people are not just physical symptoms. They're not just psychological needs. It's the whole package together, and you can't try and do your best for patients if you don't understand that. And come to that, of course, our learners are a full package with emotions as well as physical stuff and financial pressures and all of that kind of thing. So that's where I was coming from, because I realised that the learners were on the paramedic program perhaps were struggling with some of what some of them called in the interviews Rosie's fluffy pink stuff.
Yeah.
Because what they wanted was certainty. Oh, we got CTE. Oh no, please give me something that makes sense. And I did do a psychological ABCDE model, but I realised that the pressure to have everything all organised and in neat little boxes wouldn't really work out, because patients don't come in neat little boxes.
Yep.
But it's often what our learners want, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell me the formula, because I need to know the formula so that I can do my job properly.
Yeah.
And actually the real world isn't like that, isn't it? And I guess that's where we dip our toe in terms of simulation, is getting them to try and understand that a little bit.
Yeah. And that's hopefully what we're going to be able to get into in some of the conversations in this episode. So you had a kind of an sort of auto ethnographic kind of reflexive introduction. Tell us a bit about the actual methods that you employed to get your data.
How did you do it?
How did I do it? I interviewed students. They were complete volunteers. So, of course, it would have been very skewed for people who had particular attributes, but they stepped forward on all I told them was that it would be about exploring their learnings and in practice and following them up. So I interviewed them first of all as 8 individual students at the end of year 2 of their 3-year program, and then followed them up at the end of year 3 to see how they developed in the meantime. And I had one focus group as well, where I took some of the early findings, which were in the case of being scenarios drawn from the cases and the issues that students had raised in the first interviews, to see whether that had the ring of truth to the focus group, which it did. So it was a case study, and it was a small group of self-selecting learners.
And these were the same students in year 2 and year 3? Same students
from year 2 to year 3.
So you saw their progress?
Saw their progress, but I didn't interview them at the end of year 1, which I feel now would have been even more helpful.
Okay.
Given looking at curricula and how to think that through a bit more.
Was there a reason why you didn't do it at the end of year 1, or?
Oh, that would be ethics and all of that kind of jazz.
Okay.
And timings around getting the program up and running. Because the other thing was that it was the very first cohort of students. So, of course, we were having to work pretty intensively to get everything up and running.
Yes.
So I wasn't ready at the end
I
of year 1.
remember that time well.
There's the messiness of guinea pigs, isn't it? We often refer to that first cohort where we either revalidate a program or it's a program for the first time, and they often feel like they're the guinea pigs going through a messy world, don't they?
But a major theme, that we've talked about previously on this exact episode of this podcast is that disorientation, and that actually undertaking a doctoral study at the same time as operationalizing a curriculum for the first time. Must have been a challenging experience. So what did you find? So what were the kind of headline findings that we can dig into a bit more?
So headline was, yes, as we would all know and expect, the real world throws up issues, and students, learners feel, gosh, why wasn't I prepared for this? Oh my goodness me, every patient is different. Oh my goodness me, I can't learn a formula. So it threw up those kinds of things, but gave me more meat in terms of some of the things that helped them to move from being completely out of their depth and disorientated to then having a real sense of okayness with it being messy, as they prepared, as many of them who were preparing for registration felt. Some, it was taking a bit longer, but they were beginning to realise that every patient is different, every family is different, and we can't always cure people and make everything okay.
Yeah. And I suppose as well that actually it's not possible in a finite educational program to simulate, to train, to discuss every conceivable eventuality.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing with practice, isn't it? When in clinical placements, every single one of your learners on the same cohort will have had a different experience.
Yeah, that's very true. And I mean, if you speak, I'm sure, and if you as clinicians, before you became educationalists, is you could have 50 years worth of clinical experience between the two of you, and you still wouldn't have seen everything and know everything.
Yeah.
So I think we have to feel okay about having a curriculum that doesn't do everything. What we have to do is arm learners with the tools, and ourselves and educators also with the tools that you do the best you can, but being flexible, seeing things in context, having a range of options, or knowing who to talk to try and get the best solution you can do, even if there's limitations and even if things aren't okay.
Yeah, and you know, it's something that's just occurred to me there while you were speaking was about, so the simulation-based education is kind of, I think, wrongly seen as a bit of a panacea for standardizing healthcare educational programs.
And quantifying and fitting nicely into a box.
Yeah, and fitting nicely. But the reality is that, you know, if you conduct the same simulation twice with different learner groups, or even with the same person on a different day, you end up with different outcomes. So in that respect, it has that not randomness, but that unpredictability of clinical practice. But it doesn't have always the same level of professional vulnerability or investment in emotional emotional sort of situations that you get in the real world. So what did your participants have to say about that?
Good examples that you can share with us?
Okay, so there were quite a lot of examples, as one would expect, of end-of-life care.
Okay.
And for some of the interviewees in year 2, was a real feeling disempowered and completely lost. Maybe they hadn't perhaps experienced death or end-of-life in their family or close to them, or hadn't realised that it might trigger things that are actually close to them because they had, and experiences that perhaps showed that things don't go right and that the just in case boxes weren't there and that there was nobody to help with specialist advice at the right time in the right way, and feeling we are on our own. But there was an example where one of the students felt that and had deliberately chosen to reflect at length with her then mentor educator, which had obviously been a really helpful experience, but she was still very, very anxious about it. And I think she was confident enough when she went to later placements, including in year 3, to raise her hand and say, I'm a bit worried about this.
Yeah.
And so when there were other scenarios, she had very good help and support for her from her educator, who made sure that the list of people to contact that she'd garnered over many years of experience was given to the student, and that they talked over how things had gone or how things might go and what might help at that time. And things were a lot better. In fact, they were able to arrange an emergency respite bed for the patient, something that wasn't possible and wasn't actually wanted in the previous scenario, but was working for the patient. And they were able to get something in place with the family overnight until the hospice bed was available. And a bit that I forgot in our very first take of this, which was the mentor, the educator, encouraged the student to phone up and find out if everything had gone to plan with the patient and family's consent, and found out that the patient had moved to the hospice, was nice and comfy, and the family were really happy.
Right.
So there was a good enough ending there. And that said to me, and I saw several other scenarios, not all about end of life, where making things better and being able to gather the wider kind of community of network, whether it's community of practice or the network of people that you might know or things that you might do that you might not otherwise know, had made a real difference. But also the really focused reflection. Something that you guys said earlier about, just getting people to reflect. Some people, we've got to do an essay on it or whatever.
There's a lot of pushback sometimes, isn't there, from learners?
Whereas this focused reflection or choosing the things you want to do. I mean, in my findings, when I teased out what the learners' needs were at different phases of their learning, and what the mentor or coach did was that they really needed to decide for themselves which were the meaningful episodes or cases to focus on. And that might be because they felt particularly pleased about it and they wanted to tease that out so that whatever they'd done well enough could be replicated, or something that hadn't turned out well but might arm them with the script, the words to say. Because a lot of it was, I don't know what to say.
Sure.
It's not just I don't know what to do. And finding those things and pulling them out and reflecting on them and then trying them for size in future scenarios was, I think, quite important.
So there's a couple of things. So I think we're going to dip into the experiential learning cycle, but I want to just come back to a couple of the words that you've used, and I think they're quite important, is good enough, and also, what was the other one? Something similar. It'll do, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's important, I guess, as professionals that we obviously reach a threshold, a standard, which needs to be upheld. And in many ways, we want to try and excel that. But the messy reality of the world that we live in means that sometimes we can't always get excellence, even if we're trying to achieve it. And good enough is probably a more realistic barometer.
Yeah, and you talked previously about operating in the swampy lowlands.
Yeah,
and I think that is a really powerful metaphor.
Metaphorically, rather than just Norfolk.
Yeah, that's right.
The fens.
Yeah, the fens. Yeah. So, but there is something in that, isn't there, about if you work in a suboptimal environment, which healthcare is, then actually and expecting yourself to achieve perfection is unrealistic.
And healthcare education.
In healthcare education,
it's suboptimal.
But healthcare and healthcare education, I would say, are suboptimal environments.
But it also maybe makes it feel attainable, because if you say everybody has to be exceptional, that feels too high. And Bowlby recognised that when he thought about parenting, or mothering as it was in his time, is that with all the variables of learners, so if we go back to the swamp, so you've got a mentor who in year one knows exactly when the learner's going to fall in, tugs them back a wee bit, but not too soon and not too late and not too hard. And then later on, in maybe the second year, when they've got more experience and more confidence and can deal with not just following the guidelines, ding, 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 then maybe it is, okay, go a bit nearer the edge. Look at it. What are you worried about here? What might the consequences be? I wouldn't ever say that we want them to fall into the swamp, but maybe
get their feet wet.
Yes, and realise that it's really difficult and challenging, but actually, if it is uncomfortable, if your feet are damp, that doesn't mean to say all's lost.
No. And the swamp's a great analogy as well, because you'll inevitably see your own reflection in it. So you can do a little bit of...
beautiful.
I thought I had to drop that one in there. Even if it's not crystal clear.
But there is huge value, I think, in a piece of work, as you've done, that reconceptualizes practice as being inherently messy, murky, dark at times, challenging, and that's a really useful metaphor. Another metaphor that you've used is a tightrope. Can you talk to us about that?
The swaying tightrope. Yes, one of the learners I interviewed said that in year 2 and talked about some of the things that made a difference to how badly the tightrope was swaying or not, and how contrasting experiences between an educator who'd perhaps not recognised that things were swaying and that there was some help needed because the learner probably appeared quite confident. And then another experience with another mentor who just knew when to step lightly and go, okay, let's just pause here, or I know when to take over, or I know when to just admire the pictures and let you get on with it. So there's something there about being able to know the good enough mentor or coach or educator knows when to step in and when not to. But it will vary, as we've said, with patients, but it will vary with learners, whether somebody needs a lot of support and very overt, the person sort of peering over your shoulder the whole time, or whether it is, yes, it's okay. I know that they're around and I know that they're noticing everything, but unless they give me a signal, I'll consider it's okay.
Yeah. And that's actually, and that's why I think, well, I haven't read your whole thesis, but what I have read, to me, it occurs to me that it is an ed D, and this would, I suppose, be expected, but there is a simultaneous focus both on the learner and their transition through disorientation and exploratory phases, but also as educators, how we can help to facilitate that independence of thought. And I think there are parallels with what you describe from a practice education perspective that relate perfectly to a simulation-based education perspective. When should we push a little bit? When should we draw the learner back from the edge of the swamp a little bit? And when is it okay to let them kind of go merrily sort of splashing in? And I think that's probably why Dijkman refers to simulation as a complex social endeavor, because it requires so much insight into your learner's kind of, I don't know, embodied state at that time. You really have to be able to get in there.
And you can't just follow the script.
No.
You can't just go through the recipe or the algorithm and expect to get the outcome that you need, because because it's so complex.
That's right. And I mean, what I kind of found was that if you're looking at the kind of disorientation, for most, because we don't know always, certainly not at the outset, whether we're in practice or in an educational institution, how much life experience and what that means to the maturity and insightfulness and kind of connectedness of a learner. But basically, in the earlier stages, whether it's a practice or of the curriculum and simulation, they do need coat pegs, Ausubel's coat pegs. They do need some certainties, but they also need, as we need, to know actually it is messy, it is swampy. We cannot teach you everything, because I've had learners many times over the years who've wanted, and why didn't you teach me this? You know, why?
That expectation.
Making it explicit that there will always be exceptions, and not every patient, not every situation is the same. In fact, you may go to 10 of the same kinds of presentations that look, when you get your call, as if they're similar, and they're not at all. But they need more certainty. And of course, as Benna would say, they need to know what the rules are.
Yeah.
You don't want them going straight to adaptive expertise or mastery. Oh, I'm going to ignore all the rules now.
Yeah.
But have to be able to try to facilitate more of the messiness and more of them. There could be 10, 12, 20 or unimaginable numbers of different solutions to this, but making the scenarios more messy and less straightforward as time goes by.
Well, that's one of the challenges, isn't it? You know, to a simulation-based healthcare educator is, you know, you plan your teaching sessions weeks, if not months, maybe a year in advance. You have a prescribed set of intended learning outcomes.
But we always talk about unintended learning outcomes, don't we?
Yeah.
We always talk about unintended learning outcomes, and it's transferring that to the learner. Is we're equipping you with the tools, but there isn't a set formula.
Yeah.
And you need to explore that. And you used, you've used Taylor's model of experiential learning. I think that embraces that quite nicely.
It does. So it's not very well known about.
So we'll put it on the screen, but if you just talk to us briefly about that.
Well, Lawrence, you mentioned the disorientation phase, and I think it's disorientation is every bit as much a part and parcel for mentors, no matter how experienced in practice, when they face a new situation, because even if they've got 20 or 30 years of experience, you will face different situations. And it's about making that okay. It's okay to feel like a wally. This is where you need support. This is where you need to ask for feedback. This is where you maybe need to have the courage to say, this is going to worry me, or this kind of situation is something that I have been worry-gutting about, being anxious about. I feel I need a bit of support because I've kind of lost my sea legs. Oh, no. I'm wobbling on the tightrope. And then if the learner feels that they can begin to see what some of the stuff around is and what their role in it is, I think that's really important. Where do I fit? What am I going to do? Apart from where's the loo and what do I do if I need a wee or any of that kind of stuff. And then we get to exploitation, which is
exploration.
Exploration.
Exploitation is something completely different.
This is a different model. Rosie's gone right off script.
Yes, it's because I hadn't got my glasses on. Exploration. So you explore who does what services there are or aren't, what maybe get your books out to have a read about kind of presentation. So you begin to get some knowledge as to wrap around it, but there may be also reflective exploration as well.
Yeah.
Then there is the reorientation. So, okay, I know a bit of something. I don't know everything, but I kind of know when I'm going into this situation that this is the sort of thing I'll be doing. And then a state of equilibrium, but don't get too complacent because we can keep going round that cycle. And I think lecturers and clinicians also face that. And it's all part of making explicit. Nothing is going to be certain for everybody all of the time.
And that's such a nice segue because, looking at a model of experiential learning, and we've talked previously on the podcast about Kolb's experiential learning cycle, and it's a really useful model for talking to people about the phases of simulation. But it occurs to me, listening to what you're saying, is that there is a much higher degree of certainty in Kolb's experiential learning model, concrete experience. Actually, you can't, there's nothing concrete about a swamp, right? Which is how a majority of experience is in practice.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because what you want is a concrete experience or previous kind of experiences to anchor this exploration.
Yeah. Exploration, yeah, but it's like the experience that you have, whether it's concrete or not, is what presumably triggers that sense of disorientation. And then that exploration / reflective observation is kind of probably equivalent. And then the kind of reorientation phase, I suppose, is a kind of akin to Kolb's abstract conceptualization. Like, how do I think about applying this in my future practice?
How am I going to make sense of it, and then achieving that equilibrium? Yeah.
What I really like about Taylor's model is the uncertainty and the acknowledgement of the ongoing sense of disorientation. I really like that.
Yeah. And that is how it is, isn't it?
It is how it is.
Many other models try and, as you say, make things really concrete. And one of the, not just the findings, but my agendas that I was very, very conscious about was I'm probably not going to be able to come out with a nice recipe book for simulation lecturers or whatever, but maybe some principles, because that's the best we can do in this uncertain world.
And that goes back to that good enough principle again. Yep.
And so we talked about good enough a little bit, haven't we, in terms of navigating the swampy quagmire for the learner. Yeah. But a lot of your findings were about educators too.
So is that a happy accident? Is that an unintended learning outcome? Or was it always part of your thought process?
No, I think I was hoping to come out with some insights for the curriculum, realizing that it would not be lovely and concrete and a checklist of 20 things. But as the wonderful learners were sharing so generously their experiences, it became absolutely clear about some of the things that really made the difference between them being able to grow and develop and grow their confidence and feel okay with messiness, or not quite being sure what they needed to do in that, but knowing that they would try and do the best that they could do. And the good enough characteristics, as opposed to the things that didn't really help them. And what I did was I then mapped some of those needs of the student against Taylor's model, the things that they needed in the different phases, whether it's in practice or in simulation. And then I did the counter opposite, which was the mentor behaviors and actions in disorientation and exploration and reorientation that would facilitate students in the hope that that could be something for educators and lecturers to hang on to, knowing that, first of all, we don't want to set the bar so high that anyone involved in helping learners would feel like, how can I be there? And recognizing also that there are some concrete things that they said made a real huge difference.
Yeah, and the parallels between the messy reality of practice and the messy reality of being a simulation-based educator do strike me, that actually at times your learner is disorientated or exploring, and you need to adopt a different approach depending on the situation you find the learner in. And it's not necessarily right, a year one needs this, a year three needs this. It's much more contextual than that. So what does that hinge on? What does that capacity to adapt to the learner, do you think? Not
just adapt to the learner, but also adapt to the world, again, the messy world that you're in. You know, you're there as if we take paramedic, for example, you're there as a paramedic first, and then you're there as an educator for a student. So it's an extra responsibility, but you've got all of the baggage from your clinical things that also need to be embraced. And then you need to provide an educational environment for your learner to get the best out of their experience. And that doesn't always happen, I guess.
No, and I suppose I can distill it even further to say that if a clinician is truly person-centered with the patient and family, so they listen, they adapt, they flex, they're perhaps creative, so it's adaptive expertise, even perhaps beyond Benner's mastery, because they're thinking about a unique fix of some sort, even if it doesn't make everything okay, but it's just good enough. And if they can do that, they can do this fine, because it is listening, it is treading lightly, it's being aware. Do I just be in here? Do I just give a little bit here? It is that package, which is about somebody who's really, truly insightful and emotionally intelligent. But how hard is that, given that healthcare is not a walk in the park?
Yeah,
no,
quite right.
Yeah.
No. Although I remember some of the learners saying what a privilege it was to be able to have the time that you had in somebody's home, which maybe for some other professionals is harder to get that amount of time. And they did say how much of a privilege that was, especially when they were able to feel that they could make some difference, even if it wasn't cure and it wasn't all A-OK.
Yeah. And I think there's, again, a parallel there, isn't there, with as a simulation educator, you might have a clear intention at the start of what you would like to achieve, but actually sometimes, you know, like you were mentioning about unintended learning outcomes, you know what, actually today I think that's probably good enough. You know, what we've managed to create today together is actually good enough. And that's quite a useful thing to be able to take away, rather than, you know, we must do this final simulation because otherwise we're not going to do everything we set out to do. Actually, hey, you know, if we achieve partly what we set out to achieve, that's good enough, and that's okay.
And what level of learning, because, you know, Lawrence knows how learning outcome, especially if they're psychomotor, it's like, write your own learning outcome, or we will just explore how people feel about end of life when it is impossible to find the resources that are needed.
So Lawrence and I often talk about, in simulation, having a technical set of learning outcomes, a practical set, and then maybe some non-technical. But there also needs to be some exploratory learning outcomes, don't there? That don't necessarily have an answer. But it again, encourages this reflective conversation. And again, for those students who push back on reflection, that's where you lean into the debrief, which is all around a reflective conversation.
Absolutely. And obviously some of the things might be about professional identity and values based, because that was really important. Those people, the interviewees, and that's why I remind people that they were self-selected. So other learners might have said different things. all demonstrated, the end of year 2 and the end of year 3, real sense that patients are complete people and they wanted to do the best they could for an individual patient. And they talked about patient-focused or patient-centered care in a way that maybe if you are just wanting to work down a rubric, you think about achieving the task against the presenting diagnosis.
Yeah.
And that I think said to me something really important that we need to extrapolate in learning, which is actually it's that person and that family and that moment and feel okay. Or it's that learner in that simulation. So get rid of your learning outcomes.
There's a bold statement.
Fighting talk.
What do we always say? Start with your learning outcomes?
Yeah, I think-
Rosie's just thrown the cat amongst the pigeons there.
Yeah, Rosie is setting fire to the previous 38
All right.
episodes of SimCast.
or get the learner to write one learning outcome for them.
Yeah, and
Well,
that,
great idea.
Yeah, I mean that is
That's slightly less radical, I know.
but this is why we love you, Rosie, because you are radical, and I think sometimes you have to challenge orthodoxy in order to break new ground and make progress.
Yeah.
And whilst I don't think that I would completely agree with tearing up the learning outcomes, because I think
I was being facetious.
I know you were, but I do think that there is a parallel again here between the kind of the operational notion of clinical practice and the very operational idea of education being driven by learning outcomes. And I think that one of the things that I've thought about recently is how there should be an increasingly tactile rather than tactical approach to both healthcare and education. That we should be we are learner focused, we are learner centric. But what you're describing is actually taking that to another level, really, and centering the learner within the simulation or within the practice-based learning environment to facilitate their development, which I think is really interesting.
And one thing I forgot about in take 1 was emotional intelligence. So some of the characteristics of emotional intelligence are really important to clinical practice. And actually, often people carry with them the idea that intelligence is IQ level. And I think maybe any learning outcomes that seek to tease that out, as well as attributes of professional identity and values, not just the psychomotor. Yes, you can have some psychomotor. A few, maybe scale back and have a few other ones as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
No. I think it's a really important point, actually, because I think technical and non-technical learning outcomes are probably fairly, I wouldn't say maybe not ubiquitous, but certainly things that people are aware of.
And they're also very linear, aren't they?
But open questions about values and those kind of broader, more philosophical aspects of practice are perhaps overlooked in a busy curriculum.
Yeah. Rosie, what would you like to come out of your research? What would you like it to change, apart from tearing up the rule book and getting rid of all of the learning
Having
outcomes?
a bonfire of learning outcomes.
Well, okay, leave it 10 years.
Yeah.
People have often said to me, Rosie, you said this 5 years ago. Yeah, okay. I think I'd like to see that healthcare curriculum, not just for paramedics, but for other health and care professionals, acknowledges just how challenging and messy and swampy and wobbly and all of that kind of thing practice is. But and that the learner needs to begin to feel okay about that. So some of the simulations deliberately and provocatively set out to trigger that. Yes, you go from more certainty and more clarity, but make it more messy. And something that you guys said to me earlier, maybe thinking about how some of these kinds of scenarios can be used for educators to see how the education that they offer, the support they offer, may be messy, but some of the key things that can help them to be nearer the good enough.
So a message both there for learners and educators alike, that both environments, both the clinical and the educational, are complex and messy.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I'm thinking straight away of, okay, yeah, great, put a load of messiness into simulation, and then I'm thinking with my psychological safety hat on, just how challenging that would be, and then thinking, well, actually, that's the messy reality that we're in.
Yeah, and it's and then we've spoken about this on the podcast before about the importance of psychological safety, but that doesn't mean
that you can't be challenging.
Yeah, and actually, you know,
and you don't want people to be too comfortable.
No,
because there are beliefs. Claxton, I think, says, you know, the belief that I must be comfortable and what have you. So again, you can't end up with a tick list. What you have to do is try and make sure that most learners feel a bit of discomfort, and that provokes them into thinking about it without tipping people over the edge. So some people may be triggered, so there's that side, and some people may have experienced that and be cool with it.
Yeah.
So actually, it means that makes simulation extremely complex, messy, and wobbly.
Yes, indeed.
Sorry.
I think we'll leave that on there. We could literally talk. Well, we have literally talked about this for hours, but half of it wasn't recorded. Rosie, thank you so much for coming to speak to us on the podcast. We've loved it, and I'm sure that there's another episode in the making where we can explore it further.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosie, Dr. Rosie Doy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting me and allowing me to waffle on and put a bonfire under learning outcomes.
And if you would like to put a bonfire, if you've got any comments so thank you for listening to SimCast. We hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you have enjoyed the episode, do drop us a comment and let us know why. And also, do like and subscribe to SimCast if you haven't already, to keep in touch with all things sim.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.